Hey there, I'm Gab Lavoie. Today I want to show some patches I made for the Prophet 10. With the Prophet 10 having up to 10 voices, I felt like it sort of just wants me to make a lot of big pads, polysynths, synth keys types of patches. So we're going to hear a lot of those today. And that's what the first one is. It's really kind of like a polysynth. This is what it sounds like. Nothing too complicated going on over here. If I add a bit of modulation, I've got a bit of LFO applied to oscillator B's frequency and the filter. You can get a bit crazy with it if you want. But yeah, it's a nice patch. The next one is another sort of pad polysynth, but it's got movement. I'll just play it. The main thing happening here is I've got the LFO affecting, I think it's the frequency of oscillator A, and I've set it in a way that it's always, I've set the oscillator with a square wave, and it's set in a way that it's always jumping from a fifth above the note that you're playing. So if I hold a C, it's sort of jumping between a G and a C. And I think oscillator B is doing some fun stuff modulating the pulse width of oscillator A through the polymod, which gives it that little bit of a glitchy texture. And if you use the mod wheel, then that distance of the pitch modulation gets higher. So I tend to leave it just at the bottom with this one. But this was a fun patch to make. We got more pads. Here's another one. So pretty simple sort of polysynth kind of pad. There's a sort of pulsating thing happening. Again, I've got, with the LFO, I've combined a triangle and a square wave, and that's being routed both to the pulse width of oscillator A and B. And you can make the LFO that much more dramatic by using the mod wheel. To the point where, like, because of where I've set the pulse width, the sound is cutting out in certain spots. If you want that sort of effect. Okay, the next one might be one of my favorites. Here it is. So this one, what's happening, we've got a combination of the noise and the LFO modulating the filter, also the pulse width of oscillator B. But sort of the main thing that's happening, the LFO is set kind of slow, and the aftertouch is set to increase what the LFO is doing. And so when you're getting that filter sweep from the LFO, you're sort of getting that noisy texture to it, which I think is pretty cool. And if you don't want the filter to open up completely, or rather, what I should say, if you don't want to use the aftertouch, you can also use the mod wheel. Moving on, we've got another sort of simple polysynth. Aftertouch is routed to filter. So you can be pretty expressive with that. All right, now we have a patch that actually isn't a polysynth. This is basically just a classic acid bass sound. We've got the resonance real high. And one of the other things going on, I've got a slow LFO just doing a sweep through the filter as well. So if I was to hold a note, I've also activated the unison button, so it's set to mono, but I've given it a couple of extra voices as well. So it's a bit thicker than just mono on its own. I think it's set to 3 voices specifically with the unison effect. All right, here's another sort of pad texture kind of thing. With this, I was experimenting using oscillator B as a modulation source through the polymod, and yeah, I've set it to a low frequency. Because oscillator B tracks the keyboard, it's modulating the pulse width of oscillator A, and because it tracks the keyboard, it's doing it at different rates depending on the note that you play. That gives us that cool glitchy texture. And the LFO is set a little bit slow. It's modulating the frequency and the pulse width of oscillator B. So you can introduce a bit more variety that way in this patch. This is a synth keys patch next. It's fairly sweet sounding. I've routed aftertouch to both filter and LFO. It gets a little crazy if you like press down all the way, but it can be a really nice expressive touch. You can also control the LFO just from the mod wheel if you don't want the filter to open up. Next, another synth pad. We've got some slow filter movement being controlled by oscillator B through the polymod. It's modulating the filter. And we've got this cool kind of mellow texture happening. I've also got a pretty drastic envelope set on the pretty drastic decay on the filter envelope. There is also a slow LFO being applied to the filter as well. You can make it more drastic with the mod wheel. See, it cuts out for a long time. Now it's back. This next one is kind of like a synth key, a sound effect. I think of it as a bouncy ball sound. And with this, what I did, we've got oscillator B, which is, again, routed to the filter. It's a little bit faster than last time. It's still in the low frequency range. I actually don't have it tracking the keyboard on this patch. But what I've done is I'm using the LFO to modulate oscillator B. So basically, the speed at which we're modulating the filter is changing. And it sort of makes me think of like a bouncy ball, I guess. As the ball like gets closer to the ground, it starts to hit the ground faster and faster. Something like that. Next patch, like a super polysynth. I had to check there to make sure it wasn't peaking. So a few important things happening here. One of the big things contributing to the sound is both oscillator A and B are active. like they're both audible, but I also have oscillator B modulating the pulse width of oscillator A, which is set to a pulse wave, while also being audible. If I were to take off that modulation, the character of the sound is quite a bit different. Putting it back. The aftertouch is routed to the filter. And one of the other big things contributing to the sound as well is I've set the unison to the chorus, which is just basically doubling the voices. So on this patch, we're actually just getting 5 voices at a time. But if I take it off, it feels like something's missing a little bit. So just like a super polysynth kind of sound. It's nice. I like it. Next patch, again, I guess I was really into making these super polysynth sounds. Similar, but a little bit sweeter sounding to my ears, a little more sugary. Once again, I've got aftertouch routed to the filter. Velocity as well, so you can play a little quiet. No unison on this one, so we can play as up to 10 voices if we want to. Still in the big polysynths. Here we go. This is the next one. Sharper attack on this. But we've got velocity set to both filter and amp. And I am using the unison as a chorus once again. So we're 5 voices on this patch. The velocity is like really quite expressive on this. Another polysynth sort of sound. This one's a bit different. It's sort of a sync polysynth. Maybe even a bit like a synth keys. And we've got an envelope controlling the frequency of oscillator A, giving us that sort of classic synth sound, or sync sound. Velocity set to both the filter and the amplifier. So you play harder, gets brighter. Aftertouch to LFO. So lots of ways to get expressive with this patch, which is a lot of fun. The next one's another kind of pad polysynth. This one's a bit different. To me, it feels very like staticky. It almost sounds as though you've got the sound of like static on TV kind of mixed into this. And I think there's a couple things in the way that I've programmed it that are contributing to that. I think I'm definitely using a blend of LFO and noise as modulation, particularly in the pulse width, the frequency of oscillator B, and also the filter. But there's sort of this plateau of like static that I'm hearing. And what's happening there is I'm using the polymod and using the filter envelope as a mod source to modulate the pulse width of oscillator A. And so it's sort of sitting higher, I guess, somewhere in the higher range of the pulse wave for oscillator A, before sort of going back to somewhere where it doesn't sound so thin, I guess. But it's kind of an interesting effect. Other small details, I've got both velocity and aftertouch routed to the filter. So if I play soft, play hard, and then if I use aftertouch, and I also have unison set to chorus again. Quite a big fan of that feature, as obviously I've used it on quite a few patches. With this patch, we're at, can I count? 5 voices. Yeah, just one hand. Yeah, very interesting effect. We've got another sort of polysynth pad kind of thing. This is what it sounds like. With this one, we've got this sort of movement happening in the pads, almost a little bit of a glitchy warbliness. Movement is happening via oscillator B. I set it to low frequency, and with the poly mod, that's modulating both our filter and oscillator A pulse width. And it is tracking the keyboard, so you're getting that effect where higher notes modulate faster than lower ones. Something I really like about being able to use oscillator B as a modulation source. Apart from that, we've got a little bit of LFO applied to frequency A and pulse width of oscillator B. And if I accentuate it here, or I make it a little more dramatic with the mod wheel, that's sort of what's giving that warbliness that we're hearing. And once again, I'm using unison as chorus. It's a really lovely effect. And the last patch I'm going to show you today is another polysynth. Kind of like a super polysynth. I'm actually only using 2 waveforms between the 2 oscillators. Oscillator A is a pulse. It's got some modulation happening, I think coming from oscillator B. Oscillator B is a saw wave. And without fail, once again, unison as chorus. It's pretty subtle, but the LFO is modulating the frequency of oscillator B. You can sort of hear it in the background there. If I make it more dramatic. But yeah, very nice, big polysynth. Clearly, I enjoy making that type of patch a lot. And I think that's it. Thanks so much for sticking around and watching me talk and play these synthesizer patches. I have a lot of fun making sounds on the synthesizer. I'm probably going to make more at some point. See ya.